G'day, it's Regan here from Coral Sea Property Management, and I'm making this video to explain some of the changes coming into effect in regards to ending tenancy agreements from the 1st of October this year, 2022. These changes are coming into effect because of changes and amendments made by the Queensland Government to the RTRA Act, which is essentially the piece of legislation that governs residential tenancies in Queensland. And this video I'm specifically focusing on changes around ending a tenancy. At the moment, a landlord has the option to issue tenants a notice to leave on a variety of different grounds, or with specifying a without grounds notice to leave, essentially not providing a reason, however ending the tenancy agreement regardless. And at the moment they have to provide 2 months notice, and it can't be during a lease period itself, which is why at the end of someone's lease we can issue them a notice to leave, or if they're on a periodic agreement, we can issue them a notice to leave as well. Just for the context of this video, I just want to explain the difference between a fixed term agreement and a periodic agreement. So a fixed term agreement is a lease agreement that has a fixed start and end date. That doesn't mean that the tenant has to move out at the end date, but there's a fixed term for the lease, so that legally binding contract for them to rent the property during that time. Now, a periodic agreement at the moment occurs at the end of a fixed term agreement, or you can sign a periodic lease agreement itself. And what that means is the tenancy has a start date, but it doesn't have a fixed end date. So it goes on what could be considered like a month-to-month process. At the moment, if you're on a periodic tenancy, the lessor or the agent can give a notice to leave with no grounds, and they can provide 2 months notice, and then the tenant has to move out after that. Now, it's really important. So what these changes are that are coming into effect, they're essentially removing the no grounds notice to leave, and they're instead providing a list of prescribed reasons why you can issue a notice to leave. Luckily, one of those prescribed reasons is the end of a fixed term agreement. However, there isn't a prescribed reason to end a periodic tenancy agreement, which means if you don't issue a notice to leave at the end of a fixed term agreement, 2 months out, you could be in a situation where you can no longer issue a notice to leave unless you meet one of the other prescribed grounds that they've got and the conditions associated with that. So some of the new prescribed grounds for being able to issue a notice to leave: change of use. So you can give the tenant a notice to leave if the property's use is to be changed for other than a residential property for a period of at least 6 months. And it's important to note that you still need to give 2 months notice for this. And also yourself or the property manager can be fined if you then re-rent that out as a residential property within a 6-month period. Another ground is, for example, the sale of a property. So if you wanted to put your property up for sale, that's a prescribed reason where you can end a tenancy agreement. Now, this isn't ending a fixed term tenancy agreement, but this is ending a periodic tenancy agreement, or at the end of your fixed term agreement. Conditions associated with that is the property cannot be re-let for up to 6 months, and there are pretty substantial fines as well with that. And that's important to consider if you're putting your property up for sale. Maybe you try and sell it for 90 days, you don't get the offer that you want for it, and then you're in a situation where you want to re-let it. Well, unfortunately, if you've used this ground to end the tenancy that was in place, you can't re-let your property for 6 months, quite simply. Now, not to stress, however, so what we've done at Coral Sea is we've developed different systems and processes that will ensure that at the end of a tenant's lease agreement, they don't go on to a periodic agreement, which is quite bad for you nowadays if they do, because one, they don't have security. The tenants can give you 2 weeks notice and they can move out, and you can no longer give them notice unless you meet a pretty strict amount of prescribed grounds. And it also means that you don't have that assurity that your tenant's going to continue paying rent. Especially if you're in one of our quiet periods in Townsville, you might be stuck with a property that's then vacant, and you've got a vacancy cost associated with that. So what we're going to do is we're going to approach these changes in a couple of different steps. So the first step is any owners that are currently on a periodic tenancy agreement, or where their lease agreement ends between now and the end of October, we're going to be calling you first, and we're going to be letting you know about these changes and issuing the paperwork based on the discussion with you to make sure that you don't end up with a tenancy that you can't remove at the end of the day. Then we're going to keep processing it on a 3 month, 3 months running block to make sure that at the end of your tenancy agreement or 2 months out, your tenants are aware that there isn't an option for there to be a periodic tenancy afterwards. This doesn't mean that we can't negotiate a renewal with them, and certainly we start that process about 3 months before the end of a tenancy with consultation with you after we've completed a comparative market report and got up the up-to-date rent price. We can still negotiate with the tenant, and we still will do that. However, we will make sure that if a tenant doesn't come to an agreement on a rental price, it doesn't just roll into a periodic agreement, which is the very important part of the legislation. Now, the REIQ's best practice recommendations and what they've recommended all property managers to do in Queensland is when you're signing a new lease agreement with a tenant from the 1st of October to provide them with a notice to leave as well, and explain to the tenant that that isn't a requirement for them to leave at the end of the tenancy no matter what, but it does mean that if they don't choose to renew their lease and if a lease renewal isn't offered to them at the end of their tenancy, then there isn't an opportunity to move on to a periodic agreement. Now, I understand these changes are quite long and they're complicated, and that's why you've appointed Coral Sea to manage your property and to look after it for you. But by all means, if you would like to have a discussion with myself or one of our staff members about how these changes will specifically affect your property, maybe you've got a couple of questions that this video and the information that we've sent out over email hasn't addressed, please get in contact with us. Our team are more than happy to have a discussion with you, whether you want to come into the office and we can chat in person, or if it's over a Zoom or a phone call. We want to make sure that you're 100% clear and understanding of this legislation, and 2, understand that we're going to be following a process that achieves the best outcome for you as the investment property owner, to make sure that your property remains tenanted and to make sure that we still have control over the start and the end of that tenancy agreement. Please reach out to me if you have any questions. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day.